much for being here. My name is Roshni. I'm a founder and partner at HIT Strategies. We are a progressive public opinion research firm, and we focus on the audiences that we call the emerging electorate, so young people, people of color, women, LGBTQ, basically your Democratic base electorate. How do we mobilize them and how do we message to them? And I'm so honored to be here with our esteemed panelists today to talk about an issue that I think is super important that came out of the 2022 election cycle. Obviously had been important before that, but really became a catalyst for elections in the 2022 cycle and is going to be very important to us moving on in 2024. So I would love to give you some quick introductions to our panelists who really don't need an introduction, do a little bit of a background setting here, and then let them talk about this topic with their expertise. So to start, we have Alicia Garza. She's a political strategist and organizer. Alicia founded the Black Futures Lab to make Black communities powerful in politics. She's the co-creator of Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter Global Network groups, which have been at the forefront of change in racial justice and public safety. We also have Stacey Davis Gates, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, executive vice president of the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and vice president of the American Federation of Teachers. She played a key role in the election of Brandon Johnson as mayor of Chicago, helping his campaign withstand false narratives on his public safety record. We have Stephen Claremont, a polling director at Change Research, who has worked in public opinion research and Democratic campaigns since 1993. Over the last several election cycles, he's helped the New Mexico House Democrats build and maintain durable majorities despite being attacked continually on crime. And lastly, but not least, we have Insha Rahman, a vice president for advocacy and partnerships at the Vera Institute of Justice, and vice president of Vera Action, Vera's 501c4 sister organization. She leads the development of Vera and Vera Action's advocacy priorities and campaigns across the organization, partnering with government and communities to end mass incarceration, fight for immigrants' rights, and ensure dignity behind bars and build safe, thriving communities for all. So very excited to get into this conversation with this amazing panel. Like I said, I'm going to start with a little bit of data for background context before we get into it. So really quickly, some voter context from the 2022 elections. From the Fox News voter analysis post-exit polling in the election, they asked, thinking about your own community, how concerned are you about crime? You can see here that 79% of voters said that they were either very or somewhat concerned with crime. So this was a big issue when we were thinking about how people's perception of crime was going into the 2022 election. And of those 79%, about half were Democrats and half were Republicans. So it was a pretty bipartisan concern over crime in the country. Alongside Change Research, we at HIT Strategies have done an extensive project talking about narratives and how to combat GOP messaging and how to best build messaging around crime and public safety. One of the things that we have to recognize when we're starting to talk to communities about public safety is that a police presence does make a majority of people in the country feel more safe. Obviously, this has big racial disparities when we're thinking about it, but 63% of Americans say that a police presence actually makes them feel safer in their communities. So we have to start with acknowledging where people are in order to be able to effectively message to them. Like I said, this has big racial disparities. Only 35% of Black adults say that a police presence makes them feel more safe in their community. But as with most issues, Black voters here are not a monolith. When we're looking at young Black voters as compared to older Black voters, about 57% of Black Americans over the age of 50 say that a police presence makes their communities more safe. So a really nuanced messaging approach is necessary here. Thinking about how we start this conversation now. when we asked a split sample question, one where we asked, do you support or oppose defunding the police? And you can see here, 62% of Americans oppose defunding the police. In a split sample question, we asked, do you support or oppose reallocating some funds from the police budget to non-police responses to public safety needs, such as professional teams trained to deal with mental health crises, homelessness, or domestic violence, and programs shown to prevent participation in criminal activity? By simply rephrasing the way that we ask this question, we come in with a majority support. So 51% of Americans say that they support this definition, which we all understand to mean defund the police as we talk about it colloquially. So this is really an issue that requires definition. When we actually spell out the definition of defund for folks, they're on our side. And another thing to think of here is because of the strong opposition to the idea of defund the police, when we start our messaging in campaigns that start their messaging by saying, I don't support defund the police, we're actually agreeing with the Republican framing on defund. We're agreeing that it is a problem and that we as Democrats don't have the solution to it. So we're starting on our back foot if the first thing that we're saying is, I don't support defund the police. So we need to reframe the way that we're thinking about starting off our messaging. And then also, a lot of Americans have a very nuanced idea of policing. Like I said, many said that they think that police make their communities safer. But this doesn't mean that they want increased police presence or increased police presence to deal with day-to-day issues. We know that overall around the country, a vast majority of crimes that take place day-to-day are non-violent crimes. And you can see from the bottom in this box on the graph here, Americans want alternate responders to deal with those non-violent crimes. So substance abuse episodes, panhandling, homeless encampments, someone in emotional or mental distress, someone having a medical health emergency. Vast majorities of Americans would prefer different responders to handle those situations other than the police. The situations where they do want to see police are when they are basically for our violent crimes, that they think that police are the only responders who are capable of handling those situations. So that's a little background on the messaging here, also talking about root causes. At HIT Strategies, we've been doing a lot of work in municipalities around the country, talking about crime and how to address it. This data is from Atlanta, and you can see here we asked, which of these do you think contributes the most to the cause of escalating crime and violence in your community? Overwhelmingly in Atlanta, a plurality of voters, both black and white, say a lack of economic opportunity was the thing in their community that was causing more crime. Much farther over to the right here, only 7% of Atlanta voters said that it was not enough of a police presence that was causing more crime in their community. So they're really understanding that crime it comes from a lack of economic opportunity. Because they understand that this is a root cause-based issue, they want to see solutions that prioritize addressing these root causes. So in Columbus, we did similar polling. We asked, which of these should the city of Columbus prioritize to make communities safer? You can see here it's really prevention over punishment. The blue bars are preventative. The red bars are more punishment or increasing police services. And really overwhelmingly, voters in Columbus want to see preventative solutions because they too believe that the root of crime is in lack of economic opportunity. So to wrap up here, just some quick thoughts on public safety messaging and how to craft an appropriate message for campaigns when we're talking about public safety, which all of our panelists here are going to expand on much further, but the really key points here. Number one, we want to argue for common sense solutions. A message that really worked, you can see on the screen here, but I'll highlight, a key part of this, which is when someone is having a medical emergency, don't we send paramedics? Mental health emergencies called for trained mental health professionals. People struggling with homelessness or addiction need experts to connect them with resources. This was a very strong message because it argued for common sense solutions to the problems that people saw in their communities. Our second piece of guidance here is emphasizing prevention over punishment. Like I said, in this message, the thing that stood out very clearly was the evidence is clear. Research shows a strong connection between failure to provide social services and higher rates of crime, and we have to start investing in these proven solutions, so prevention over punishment. We want to call out our over-reliance on police. This was a common theme through all of the research that we've been doing. Police cannot be the answer to every kind of societal issue. They are not mental health experts or addiction specialists or housing coordinators. Naming this for voters is really important because it brings them along. Like we said, they think police are an important part of their community, but we need to acknowledge that we're asking them to do too much. And then we also want to center solutions over conflict. Like I said, folks believe that the root cause of crime is lack of economic opportunity. So when we focus on the solutions of that versus conflict, we have a really strong message. I'm actually going to pass this over to Stephen for our fifth piece of messaging guidance, but also want to ask Stephen, after you're done talking about that, to say if you have any more to say about some of the data that you've been looking at in terms of crime messaging.
Thanks, Roshni. The key part that we found when we were taking this message and using it with different campaigns, particularly campaigns for state legislature, is always leading with not sort of like, well, crime isn't that bad, or dismissing these statistics, just dismiss them. It is empathizing with the community. They're just like, I am as troubled by crime in this community as you are. This is why I introduce legislation to ban chop shops or reinstate the statute of limitations on murder. It's really important to empathize with the communities that you're talking to, particularly when you're in races with, like, they're either toss-up races or slight Democratic races. And the next slide gets into a very sort of specific example. It's hard to read up here, but on the left side is a bunch of mail that Republicans sent against Democrats in Albuquerque, New Mexico last cycle. You'll see they twisted votes where allowing less strict licensing requirement to cut hair for formerly incarcerated felons is as that the member voted to allow child molesters to cut children's hair. And you can sort of see where that child is. They blacken the hands of the person cutting that hair because it's about as bad as mail as they can. And when we're working in those races, consultants tend to overreact when Republicans send out attacks and assuming the attacks are going to work. In this case, none of the attacks worked. And for the last 10 years in New Mexico, they've tried everything, all crime all the time, reinstating the death penalty, and none of that has actually helped them win, except an ad that was done to take out the Senate Majority Leader in 2016. The Majority Leader won in 2012 by double digits, and the Republicans ran a 60-second ad with two mothers of whose children died in horrific gun violence incidents, non-political at all, and they spent the first 30 seconds telling the story of what happened to their children, and then they went after the Majority Leader, but it wasn't so much that he was soft on crime or coddling criminals. Some of that imagery was there, but they specifically attacked him on the types of leadership traits that Democrats find important, such as what the quotes in the ad were, Senator Sanchez seems to lack the empathy and understanding of what we went through, says that we're just emotional, no empathy, no professionalism, time for a change. This was specific ads that worked because it was triggering emotions that Democrats find important. So when you're in a lean Democratic district, if they have to win Democrats, they're not going to do it with the garbage there. That will have their mail consultants in Arlington, Virginia that pump out this stuff. They'll make more money, But when they go after us on lacking empathy, lacking caring, lacking understanding of what they're going through, that's when they can win. And I'm not convinced they're smart enough yet to know it, but that's what worked in that ad. And that's the type of stuff that we need to be afraid of, not overreacting to like blatant racist cut and paste mail. And in terms of the data, like Roshni showed that slide of what voters want police for and what they don't. And that was sort of the clearest thing to me when Lauren Goldstein, who was on our team working on this, who's now part of the HIT team, showed me this when it came out, was the biggest surprise is that like the media and Democratic strategists assume voters don't understand nuance. You can hear that all the time when people, like very insider people, talk about politics. But what this slide shows is voters intrinsically know what police should be for and what they should not. And part of the problem that we faced, part of the reason for this project, was a lot of bad polling in 2020 created unrealistic expectations of how Democrats would perform, particularly in US House districts. So when that surprise happened, and there was a lack of a like clear reason why, like in Washington, bad narratives took hold. So the belief that was Democrats embraced defund, that's why they lost. There were members of Congress and like very powerful people echoing that. It was wrong. Voters understand nuance. This slide shows that. And defund let us be too defensive in our heads in the last election. And I think what this research shows, what the sort of non-existent red wave showed us, voters understand nuance. We need to be on the offense at all times and not let Republicans get us into defensive messaging. But when we pivot to safe communities, less violence, common sense, that's what works for us.
Alicia, I'd love to come to you. The Black Lives Matter movement really spearheaded these evolving discussions around prevention over punishment, shifting police budgets to public safety alternatives, and so on. But a two-parter here. What are some further opportunities that we have to operationalize this debate into something that the majority of voters, and especially the majority of Black voters, want to see? And how do we balance the demands of activism in the political discourse without alienating our activists, but also not leaving any gaps for the right to exploit?
How y'all doing? Yeah? All right, that's what's up. I was like, hey. So there's a couple things that I think are important for us to kind of grapple with here as we go into another really important election cycle. The first one is that I know that this last year has been a lot of conversation about, did we go too far? Right? Y'all have heard that. You probably even had that discussion yourself. Did we go too far? Did we go too far with defund? Did we go too far with, maybe we got a little bit too radical and now it's time to get back to common sense politics. Okay. But here's the thing. We are in an environment that is asking us to do something different. Number one, we're in an environment that's asking us to keep bringing bold ideas about how to solve some of the most enduring challenges of our time. We are also in an environment where we're in crisis and under attack, and we have to actually balance bold ideas, right, with what it looks like to actually win things for real people. And I think, when we look at Black voters in particular, Black voters are a case study in how to do that and how to do it well. Because when we go into these election cycles, rightfully so, right, we are thinking about what's going to move Democrats and what's going to move Republicans. And we have to remember there's all these constituencies in there that are actually thinking about themselves not as Democrats or Republicans, but as people who need real solutions for real challenges. Yeah, and I feel like I have to say that in rooms like these because we are both strategists and tacticians, but we're inside of a kind of a little bit of a narrow box, so I'm going to ask us to breathe together. Yeah, no pun intended. I think what's important to also note here for all of us and I say this to my team all the time at the Black Futures Lab and the Action Fund, I say, you know, the conversations that we're having in this room are not the conversations, not the same conversations that are happening in the communities where we're door knocking and talking to people about the things that they care about. Yeah? So when we are knocking on doors and talking to people in North Carolina, talking to Black voters in Wisconsin, in California, in Georgia, people at the doors are not talking to us about how do we defund the police. That doesn't mean that people don't want new alternatives around public safety. It means that's not the first thing people talk to us about. It's not the second, third, fourth, or fifth thing. The first thing people talk about is inflation and the economy. The rent is too damn high. It's too expensive to live here. I'm getting fined and feed to death. I'm worried about the elders in my community and whether or not they're going to be able to get by. That's the number one thing people say. Second thing people talk about is getting guns off the street. I really want my community to be safe. I want us to stop killing each other and hurting each other. I want us to be a community. And then the third thing people talk about is how crazy politics is getting right now. Right? And then you can go down the list of all the other things that people care about, like their housing conditions and health care and all of those things. And so it becomes important for us to remember, and when we went into this last election cycle and worked with HIT to try to understand what is it that Black voters are talking about in these states that we care about. What we found, right, was something very different than what we were hearing from Democrats. Okay, Democrats were saying, we got to get in front of the GOP on crime, and they're telling us we're soft on crime, so we got to show them we're hard on crime. Then Democrats were also saying, we need more funding for police. We need to reinvest in police. And our president was saying that, right? Okay. And they were saying that that's what Black people wanted. Well, I've talked to all these Black communities, and they really want, because crime is out of control, and violence is out of control, and Black communities are up in arms about crime and violence. So the other thing we have to start doing is start asking, well, what communities? And what are you actually saying to people? And what are you asking people about? Because when we polled with HIT and when we knock doors, that's not actually what people are saying. What people are saying is, we want safety in our communities. I don't want to take any more money from my community because there's already money being taken from us. Our libraries aren't open, our schools aren't open, we don't have grocery stores. I don't want you to take not one more thing from this neighborhood. So don't come over here talking about it's already defunded. That's right. Right? And then the next thing people say is, but if we were to invest in community, this is what I would do. I would make sure people had jobs. I would make sure people had, mental health services. I wouldn't send police to go do that. They're not saying I don't want police. They're saying I wouldn't send police to go do that. Okay, I'm seeing way too much adverse effects coming from police doing what they're not trained to do. But it doesn't mean that I don't want police to deal with what happens if my house gets broken into, or God forbid, somebody who I love gets killed. I definitely want police to do something about that. That's what we hear. And so when we hear these things about more money for police, we actually have to force our leaders to get more nuanced and to not swallow that, because we've done this like 6 times now in the last, I don't know how many years. Well, Black people want it. No, Black people are saying they want more police, so that's what we're gonna do. And we never ask the question, who? What'd they say? Y'all remember the crime bill? Okay, we did that then, too. Well, Black people want it. Bill Clinton said Black people want it. But actually, what folks said they wanted was investment. That's right. What folks said they wanted was more resources. And what people received was more punishment and more of the stick and less than the carrot. Okay? So our job as people who are mobilizing voters, activating voters, and also trying to change the balance of power in cities and states across this country is to hold people's feet to the fire around those particular questions. Last thing I will say here, and then I will turn it back to you, Roshni, is as organizers and people who have a big vision for what is possible, I'm not arguing that we lose any of that. We just have to remember that these conversations, right, are not the same conversations that are happening in the places where we need people to move and do things. So we got to bridge those conversations, right? Doesn't mean don't have those discussions with people. Definitely have them regularly, not just when you want stuff from people. But then we also have to dig into our organizer selves and say, well, if this isn't where people are right now, I'm being honest about that. My grandma don't want to defund the police, so there's that. So what can we do to move grandma?
That's right, organizer.
What can we do to move grandma? What does grandma need to hear? What does grandma need to feel? What does grandma need to see in order to become a part of our movement? But we cannot assume that just because people are a certain way, Black, that means that there's a whole set of things that folks are going to do just on the basis of being Black. So that's a note for us as organizers, right? That we actually have to keep organizing. I'll leave that there.
Thank you. Stacey, I'll come over to you. Obviously, Chicago was one of the more recent epicenters of this debate that we're seeing on public safety. But unlike other candidates in the midterms who tried to lean away or deflect on this issue, Mayor Johnson took a completely different approach. Can you give us some deeper insight on how that strategy unfolded in the campaign, especially as the race went into a runoff and you needed to gain a lot of new voters in a short amount of time?
Wow, first off, I am just like having the time of my life right now.
Yay.
Yo, to sit next to this woman who is just as brilliant as anyone could have made you. Oh my God, I'm so thankful and honored at the same time because she actually is a part of the movement that helped elect our brother, Brandon. See, we are going to talk a little bit about strategy, but I'm also going to talk about Terrence, our brother at HIT, who is also responsible for helping to elect our brother Brandon. And no one in here knows what I'm talking about because they weren't here knocking doors or they're not discernible organizers and political operatives in Chicago. But let me explain to you, perspective is why we're losing. It's called perspective. And I'm so glad that I don't marry myself to remarks before I get on a panel or give remarks because you won't be compelled by the energy you get from being around brilliance. So it's the perspective that helped to shape the moment that we get to experience in Chicago right now because Terrence is asking voters the right question. We use polling wrong in this country. We use it as a destination and not the point of origin for the organizing. I ask you a question to know how you feel about a thing so I know how to talk to you about a thing. I'm a teacher in my real life. So we start with an assessment, and that's what data is. But you also have to write the right assessment, which is what Terrence gets to do. And it is his perspective that created the data and the question that was answered and the complexity that Alicia been telling y'all for years exists. But you don't believe her because it's not data. Because we don't think organizers are the most brilliant species on earth. Perspective. Perspective comes when you also get a labor leader who is Black and who says that our liberation will come through Black people. Because y'all keep asking us for our vote. But then you want to marginalize the way in which that vote is captured, and I'm still not liberated. So you get a union leader, her name was Karen Lewis, who, black woman, native Chicagoan, who creates a pathway in the city to run experiments that proves that you can value the complexity of public safety and have that discussion and win on it.
That's right.
Because we did everything that everyone told us not to do in order to get to this point, because our perspective told us that we were right. So this whole conversation around defund was a send-off, meaning they knew we were right. Because they too have asked the question and they have seen the data. Be clear, no one is sinking hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars into something that has not been tested.
Yeah.
They understood the test they were running because they were organizing people. Those Republicans are organizing people. They know where people stand on public safety because they have the same data we have, which means that they got to take them in a different way. They're not using the data as a destination. They're using it to chart their organizing path forward. If you do not have organizers in your space with perspective that doesn't come from a white suburban area, you are going to win. If you listen, if you put resources and support behind that perspective. Because we've done it in Chicago. And if you can do it in Chicago, with black people who run a teachers union, with an independent political organization, with teachers, with black voters, you can do it anywhere in this world. You can, because the data, when you are asking the right question based on your perspective, and then you have organizers to help you create the capacity, the imagination to bring forth the justice and the equity. Because that's what defund is about, status quo. It was never about freedom and liberation because we didn't say defund, we said fund. But when we get mad, we say a lot of stuff. Understand what the struggle has been since emancipation. It is the same thing that Bernie said. It is the same thing that the Freedom Budget said. It is the same thing that the Black Lives Matter movement is saying. It is the same thing, you all. They have data to say that we have won the argument. Perspective. Whose perspective? How do you run experiments and support perspective building? How do you clarify how it's deeply connected to empirical results? And if you need money in order to conduct these experiments, how are you funding the spaces that are courageous enough to do that? And then how are you compelling the other places that have those resources to play with you?
Insha, I want to come to you now. I know that you've done a lot of similar research with the Vera Institute that reveals a lot that progressives can use to kind of counter the popular Beltway and media narratives about crime. So I'd love for you to talk about some of that research and also if you have any examples of successful campaigns using this type of narrative.
So we came to this work as policy people. My organization, we work on criminal, legal, immigration, and justice reform. And what we found is that in the last couple of years, it has been impossible. It's been so hard to move for the kinds of policies we need that make our communities better because we don't have the politics on our side. And when we have the politics, then we win on the policies. And so through our 501c4, Vera Action, we started about 1.5 years ago to start and look at how do we actually change the conventional wisdom in politics around preventing crime, delivering safety, and saying we can have safety, accountability, and justice, because what we know from all of the research, what we know from our work on the doors, what we know talking to people about the policies that they want to see, is people don't want this politics of scarcity, that you can have one or the other, you can have safety or justice, but you can't have both. People feel strongly we can have safety, we can have accountability, and we can have justice. So what we found from our research is, first and foremost, there is a conventional wisdom that if people, especially black voters, say, I am concerned about crime, and black voters are more likely by a margin of 2 to 1 than white voters to say, I'm worried about crime in my community, in my neighborhood, when my kids go to school, when I walk outside. The conventional wisdom in politics is that means that they want more of the same tough on crime status quo. And what we found from our research is that's simply not true. And we cannot be on the opposition's playing field with our rhetoric and with our language and with our policies and with our politics. We've got to create our own playing field, and that's how we've got to run. And so the first thing, to know here is do not be afraid. Right? When you get attacked for being the defund candidate or being soft on crime, the very worst response is to say, no, I too want to fund the police, or no, I am tough on crime. And why is that a really bad response? Because that makes you indistinguishable from your opposition. And what we know from the polls is that voters across the political spectrum, across big cities, rural communities, say neither party, not Republicans or Democrats, are doing well on their handling of crime. Both are way underwater. They don't break 50%. But to the extent that Republicans have an advantage over Democrats, it's because they talk about the issue of crime more. And there is a fundamental fear that people have that we want to be safe, we want our kids to be safe, we want our communities to be safe. And so if progressives, because it's not really about Democrats, it's about people who are fighting for our communities and for families, if we own the narrative around safety, that's when we win. So I just want to give 3 quick examples of where we've seen a new narrative around safety, accountability, and justice work. And I want to give 2 examples of where it works, and one that is a good, important cautionary tale in New York for how we don't do it again in 2024. So the first example I want to give is from Pennsylvania in the U.S. Senate race in the midterm elections, John Fetterman. We all know John Fetterman won. He beat his opponent by almost 6 percentage points in a really hard-fought race. But the story that doesn't get told about that is that John Fetterman won, not just in general, but on the issue of crime and safety. And the GOP spent over $10 million on ads calling John Fetterman soft on crime. There were literally billboards, for those of you who are from Philly or from the collar counties outside of Philly, that said Fetterman equals poverty and crime. There were ads run basically showing John Fetterman supports murderers and wants rapists out on the street. And what John Fetterman did is he didn't back away and pivot and talk about another issue like democracy or abortion. He didn't leave the attack hanging. And then he didn't do what we often see Democrats do, which is to stay on that playing field and say, no, I too am tough on crime. What he did is he actually owned the conversation about preventing crime and delivering safety. He said at every turn, I'm John Fetterman, I'm running on my record on crime. And what he did was then say, we can have safety and justice. So when he got attacked as lieutenant governor for granting more clemencies than anybody else in Pennsylvania, he didn't back away from supporting clemency or say, but only for the deserving. He actually talked about, I would do this again, and he ran an ad that showed 2 brothers that he had granted clemency to. I mean, that's an amazing piece of political theater. I watched it, and I felt really moved as somebody who cares deeply about justice reform. And just as a matter of politics, it worked because it put him on his own playing field about what he stands for. And again, voters want safety and justice. They believe we can have both. And so the proof is in the pudding. You look at the exit polls in Pennsylvania, you see there were 11% of Pennsylvania voters who said crime is my top voting issue. 51 to 49, they voted for John Fetterman over his opposition. So he came out on top on this issue, an issue that is often assumed is just going to be a liability for Democrats. There's no way to turn it into an asset. So there is a beautiful playbook out there for us, and it's in Pennsylvania, which is not just a wholly sort of, blue state, it has many pockets of red voters, of swing voters, of rural communities. And if you look at the breakdown, even in those more rural communities, in swing communities, John Fetterman won simply because he owned the issue. Next, I'm going to talk about New York, and it's where I'm from, so I feel like I can call it out for what it is, which is a real missed opportunity to actually win on both policy and politics. And so for those of you who know, in New York, we passed bail reform in 2020. It was single-handedly the most important decarcerative policy we have passed in that state. We watched the jail population decline by 40% literally overnight. Wow. There's so much freedom that happened as a result of that law. And what we know is we were winning. We did an amazing job because the backlash we got to that reform, it's unlike anything else I have ever seen. And what we saw, all of our Democratic leaders who championed the law, who passed it, the minute they got the attacks, they backed away from it. They literally started talking about something else, abortion, which to any voter, doesn't matter who you are in New York, you don't actually think your access to abortion is under threat. Let's be clear, it's New York. Or they would actually back away from supporting bail reform. And we have been through now 2 rounds of rollbacks to bail reform. The law is still standing, but boy, it's on life support. And what you saw is public support for bail reform before the law passed, when all of the legislators were saying, we need to end money-based detention. We need to not criminalize poverty. We need people to be able to go home and be with their families, be in their communities, be in their jobs, not rotting in jail pre-trial. 60% of voters before the law went into effect were supportive in New York. And then literally within a month of the law going into effect, the sort of nonstop backlash to it, public support for the law dropped 30%, literally just overnight. And you know that's because of the media. You know that's also because of politicians. And what we saw on the campaign trail last year is Governor Hochul and all of the Democrats running for really competitive House seats, they stayed away from the issue, or they did the I too am tough on crime playbook. And we all know what happened. New York cost Democrats the House, most likely, and a governor who in other years has won by 30 percentage points over their Republican challengers, won by less than 6. Like, that is the impact of it. And there's a great counterexample, which is in this state where we are today, in Illinois, also passed bail reform, the Pretrial Fairness Act in 2021. It's an amazing piece of legislation. We all know it's on hold right now because of some litigation that hopefully will be decided favorably next week. But the Pretrial Fairness Act also got fear-mongered on the campaign trail last year. For those of you who know the inside story on it, the Republicans spent $40 million basically calling it the purge. And they did the craziest shit, and there's no other way to describe it, excuse my language, but literally printed out fake newspapers with people's mugshots and said, this is what's gonna happen. These people are gonna be flooding your community. These black people are gonna be flooding your community. Let's be clear what was in quotes, if the law goes forward. But Democratic politicians here, everybody from Governor Pritzker on down to state senators and state legislators, they didn't back away from support of the law. They talked about the Pretrial Fairness Act and why we need to eliminate money bail. And yes, we also need to talk about your concerns about crime and safety and gun violence, but blaming the wrong cause means you miss the right solutions. If we roll back bail reform, that won't make our communities any safer. So come November 8th, 2022, every single Democratic legislator up for election won comfortably. It didn't cost them the election to be so-called soft on crime. And there was an exit poll that happened after the elections in Illinois. It turns out 60% of Illinoisans are either favorable or neutral towards the Pretrial Fairness Act. So compare that to the 30% drop in support in the law in New York. What was the difference? Is the legislators who fought for that law, who passed it, stayed supportive of it. They didn't back away from it. And that wins voter confidence that we can have safety and justice. So New York, don't do what New York did, do exactly what Illinois did. So that's my 3 examples, but there's one more, which is Chicago. And Stacey knows this race better than certainly I do. But we did some polling right after the runoff here. And we found this amazing stat, which was that Chicago voters voted for Brandon Johnson and his so-called soft on crime platform. They voted for him because they actually favored his approach to public safety over his police union-endorsed tough on crime opponent. Like, it's not Brandon Johnson won despite his approach to public safety, he won because of it. And that is such an important lesson for us, and putting Pennsylvania, all of Illinois, New York, and Chicago together. The lesson here is that this isn't a big city or a blue playbook. It's a playbook that works across the country, again, if we use the data and the polling to help us figure out what do we need to say, where are people, and how do we move them to where we know every single voter across the political spectrum is, which is we can have safety, accountability, and justice.
So I think I'll just ask a couple of questions to the table, and whoever wants to take them, go ahead, or multiple of you. But how can folks in this room or activists hold accountable our candidates or elected officials who aren't fully embracing this kind of public safety messaging?
So in one of my jobs, I was the political director with Brandon Johnson at the Chicago Teachers Union. And we helped to create the United Working Families, which Kennedy Bartley, the executive director, is sitting right there. You have to build the field in which you want to win on. That actually is the thing. So yes to everything in terms of what voters voted for, but that was after they had engaged with UWF. I saw Tanya here from Seoul, but we put things on the ballot after we organized. So we ran experiments for this. This was not just something that won, but it was also born out of people meeting the organizing moment when you find out that Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times in his back. And so there becomes a moment in which people are galvanized and they're organizing and they're pushing the systems to be different, transformed. And so like BYP 100, they meet that moment. Kennedy comes from that tradition, right? So that moment is met there, but there's also another moment that you have to meet, which was characterized by bail reform, which is characterized by Mayor Johnson's election, is that you have to cultivate the field. I can't win like arguing that I want more cops than you. In fact, we saw that in Chicago in 2015, that experiment was ran. That experiment was ran here. You see what I'm saying? You have to have a protracted struggle that has the word "and" attached to it. So, and then last thing here, and I want to make this very clear, and I need everyone in this room to hear this well. We have to fight to tell the stories of Chicago and Illinois. You have to tell them because it is the story of success with an entrenched machine politic. You have to tell this story because you can win on your values. Organizers can become mayors, but organizers can become political strategists. They can run unions. You have to tell this story as a win, not as someone's heart and soul. That's a part of it. But we were smart. And we were well resourced. And we used data to take an entire city on a drive of transformation. And we won a lot of stuff in between. I didn't mention Delia. That was a part of your story that you should tell. We got a congresswoman after bail reform in DuPage County that typically is a Republican space in a congressional district that was newly drawn, and it wasn't clear that it was a blue district. Tell that one too, because that is even more powerful one.
Right.
I've been there for all of it.
This is an immense privilege to be on this panel and getting this much insight. The other thing I'd add in terms of accountability is accountability to the media. One of the more infuriating mornings reading the horrible, dreadful New York Times was after the California primary. And before the results came in, there was already a narrative on front page that crime is going to cost the Democrats in the midterms. Even voters in California are recoiling against crime. They voted to recall the DA in San Francisco, and not all the votes that come in Los Angeles. So Rick Caruso, as the anti-crime candidate, was leading. He eventually lost badly to Karen Bass. But like the Cheza recall was about Cheza, and we did some polling right before that election, and I wrote this question, went through all of Cheza's progressive criminal justice platform, and had San Francisco voters like say, do you favor or oppose this? They favored all of his agenda at the same level they did when they elected him. They just didn't like him, and the campaign was personal. It was not about policy. So when we're calling out people and calling out politicians and calling out candidates, the media is not our friend. The New York Times, in a lot of ways, particularly political coverage, is an awful, awful publication. And fortunately, a lot of these people live on Twitter, they live online, and they need to be challenged every time they write one of these stories that further the Republican narrative, the Republicans who want a monopoly on violence in our society, and not what we actually want to accomplish, which is what all Democrats believe in, which are safe communities that are free from violence.
I just have one more question here before I give you all an opportunity for closing statements. But something that we were talking about in the green room before we came down here was the nuance and difference between reducing crime and reducing violence. So, Alicia, I'd love you to start, and Insha, if you have anything to talk about the nuance there.
I have a lot to say about this, and then I'm gonna kick you off because we gon', you know.
Hey, the energy is great.
So here's the thing. I feel like we have to just be honest about what's being said. So when we talk about crime, right? There's a way that crime gets talked about, which is about avoiding violence from people of color and Black people, and addressing the anxiety that people have about Black people coming to their neighborhood and engaging in crime. Versus, right, how some of the rest of us experience crime or violence. You can see this very clearly in this conversation about guns. Gun control, right, is what we do to prevent mass shootings, right, in communities that don't typically experience shootings. Gun violence is what we try to stop in Black communities. Gun control has a huge movement around it that is thrown flowers. Gun violence is something that's seen as what happens in Chicago. Right? So we have to actually, when we're creating messages, trying to move voters, we have to also be really clear, like, are these messages trying to assuage anxiety about the fear people have that they're going to experience crime from Black people? Because that's not going to work, right? Or are these messages for people who we're trying to bring along with us in the fight for recreating or reimagining a new way of addressing challenges? Okay? You are only going to get messages about more police, more punishment when you are trying to address fear and anxiety. When you're actually trying to resolve a problem, okay, you start talking about other solutions, including what you do with police. So I think those pieces are really important, and I know for us, we did some work last year to really push against those narratives. Number one, you're not going to use Black people to keep pushing a narrative around more punishment. You have never met a Black family that wants to send somebody else's grandbaby to jail. You just haven't. You just haven't, right? We had to push and say, stop using Black people for this narrative. If you want to know what Black voters want around crime, okay, we're not anxious about somebody coming into our community and breaking our car window or robbing our home. We're not anxious about those things. We acknowledge those things happen, and here's what you do to address that. That is very different than right? How do we make it so that people don't have to commit crime? That's the way we think about public safety. How do we make it so that people don't have to commit crime or don't have to be the victim of a crime? How do we create that environment? So if we talk to people in that way, that works. But if we talk to people in the way of, aren't you afraid somebody's going to try to jump in your window? I'm not saying those messages don't work. I'm saying be considerate about who you're using those messages with. The second piece of my thought here would be, let's actually stop using those narratives with white voters. I mean, if the whole point is to distinguish ourselves, right, from the Republican Party, which is trading on fear, and they've always traded on fear, always, then let's stop shelling out those messages to our people and trying to bring our people in the hamster wheel of fear and anxiety. We got enough stuff to deal with. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very. Insha, I don't know if you have anything to add there as well.
Well, in our message testing, we found a tagline that works really well to get at exactly what Alicia is saying, which is the opposition, they're here for scare tactics. I'm here for solutions and to have an honest conversation about what keeps us safe.
Yep.
So we're actually talking about what people want, which is safety, as opposed to what we are trying to prevent or not have, which is more crime and violence. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really important starting place, just from a messaging frame. And then what I also think is important is we often assume what the problems are that people are most worried about. And yes, in some communities, it is absolutely violence. But most people, everyday people, call it crime because that's how they think of the bad thing that happened that I don't want to see happen again. And so meeting people there to have basically a messaging frame of starting with shared values, we all deserve to be safe, name the villain, the enemy, the tough on crime status quo isn't working to keep us safe, and then you turn to my opposition, like they're here, scare tactics, playing upon fear. I'm here for solutions and an honest conversation. Then you turn to, because you have listened to communities, what is the kind of crime, whether that is gun violence, whether that is something else that actually is of top priority. Mm-hmm. That's when you get to the issue of how do we get to solutions.
I think we're far over time here, so I'll just let you all, if anyone has a closing statement or anything else that they would like to add. Otherwise, thank you all so much. Thank you to this panel. You all have been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.